Hello students, welcome to all of you to today's class. Today, once again we are going to read the last scene of The Monkey's Paw, which is being written by W. Jacobs. And as I have told you from the beginning that this is a horror story and this is an one-act play. Okay, one-act play means what? Where the completely play can be staged on the stage, and here all the sentences means all the dialogues of the characters are being written in direct speech. Got it? So in the previous class we have discussed that Mr. White wished for 200 pounds, but in turn he did get the money, but he had to lose his only son Herbert, who was only 19 years old, and he was completely caught in the machinery. He was mingled. Then go through your book so that it would be easy for you to understand. Scene 3, night time, and a week and a half later. So it was night time. It was a week and a half later means what? Almost 10 or 11 days are being passed. 10-11 दिन परे something has happened. Mrs. White stands in the doorway weeping as she looks out into the darkness. And what was Mrs. White doing? She was standing near the doorway. Se कबाट पाखरे ठिया हेछंती दांडो कबाट पाखरे, and she was crying. She was weeping. And she looks out into the darkness, and where she was looking? She was looking towards the darkness, means she was looking towards the outside place. Mr. White comes downstairs. He goes to her and closes the door, then puts his arms around her. Then Mr. White came to her, just hold her like this, and he closed the door. Mr. White, gently, come back to bed. It's cold out there tonight. Then Mr. White is speaking to his wife that you just come. It's cold outside. Let's go and have a sleep. Mrs. White, it's colder for my son. So here superlative degree is being mentioned. Adjectives are having 3 degrees: positive, comparative and superlative degree. Where comparison is being there, at that case we have to use the comparative degree. So the same thing is mentioned: cold, colder, coldest. Okay. So it is colder for my son, she sobs. Suddenly she straightens and turns, clutching her husband's arm. And Mrs. White, she was crying and she was speaking that it's colder for my son, and suddenly she straightened, means she started thinking, means she thought some idea came to her mind and she was straightened, and she also hold her husband's arm. Mrs. White wildly, the paw, the monkey's paw. Then she is speaking the paw, the monkey's paw. It means she is reminding something on the monkey's paw. Mr. White, what, where, what, kono, kodi achi? Mr. White is asking. Mrs. White, I want it. You didn't get rid of it, did you? Mr. White, it's upstairs, I think. Why? Then Mrs. White is speaking. I need that monkey's paw, and I hope you have not get rid of that paw. Mu bhabuchi tume se paw tiku नष्ट कर देनो. I need it. मु सेटा को दरकार करछि, मते दरकार सेटा. Mrs. White, crying and laughing hysterically. Crying and laughing means what? At the same time she was crying and she was also laughing out of happiness, because as we can guess that she might have got some clue to make Herbert alive. I only just thought of it. Why didn't I think of it before? Why did you think of it? And here what is he speaking? That just right now I did think of the monkey's paw. Why didn't you think of it before? And why didn't I think of it before? जे मते एबे ही से monkey's paw कथा मने पड़ला, मो आगुरु मु काई भाबिलिनी, तमे काई की भाबिलोनी? Mr. White, think of what? कौन भाबिलो? Mrs. White, the other 2 wishes. We have only had one. Mr. White, fastly. Was not that enough? Mrs. White, not. No, we will have one more. Go get it down and wish our boy alive again. Mr. White, stepping back in horror. You are insane. Mrs. White, I want my son back. I want to see my son. Mr. White, you don't know what you are saying. Mrs. White, we had the first wish granted. Why not the second? So here, Mrs. White is speaking that I need my son back. Mote moro puo darkar. You just go, bring the monkey's paw and wish, because we are having our one son, one wish granted, and then why not more too? जे जति हमर गोटे विश फुलफिल हे गला ताले आउ दुईटी विश काहे की फुलफिल हबनी? दिस वाज द क्वेश्चन ऑफ Mrs. White, but Mr. White was stunned and he started to think that you have gone insane. तमे कोन पागल हे गलनी की? Mr. White, it was a coincidence. Mrs. White, go and get it and wish. Mr. White, facing her and taking her by the arms, she has been dead 10 days, and besides, I didn't want to tell you this, but I could only recognize him by his clothes. He was mangled. Mangled means what? Twisted. His body was completely twisted, completely squeezed. in the machinery and his body was disfigured. Then Mrs. White is asking her husband to go and bring the monkey's paw. Mr. White is speaking, no, we should not do it. And then Mr. White is speaking a secret. And what is that? He is speaking that it has been 10 days. 10 dino hoy galani. And at that time, Herbert's body was looking such age, I was unable to look at it. I was scared. And now it must be horrible because his body was completely twisted, completely damaged in the machinery. If he was too terrible for you to see then, how would it be now? Mrs. White, bring him. I didn't want to tell you this, but I could only recognize him by his clothes. And apart from this, Mr. White is speaking that ମୁଁ ବି ମୋ ପୁଅକୁ ଚିହ୍ନି ପାରିଲିନି କେବଳ ତାର ସାର୍ଟ ଦେଖିକି ମୁଁ ଚିହ୍ନିଲି ଦେନ୍ ମିନ୍ସ ତାର ଡ୍ରେସ୍ କ୍ଲଥ୍ସ ଲେଖା ହେଇଛି ସୋ ତାର ଡ୍ରେସ୍ ଦେଖିକି ମୁଁ ତାକୁ ଚିହ୍ନିଲି ଯେ ହଁ ସେ ହର୍ବର୍ଟ ବୋଲି ସୋ ମିସେସ୍ ହ୍ୱାଇଟ୍ ଇଜ୍ ସ୍ପିକିଂ ବ୍ରିଙ୍ଗ ହିମ୍ ବ୍ୟାକ୍ ଡୁ ୟୁ ଥିଙ୍କ ଦ୍ୟାଟ୍ ଆଇ ଏମ୍ ଏଫ୍ରେଡ୍ ଅଫ୍ ମାଇ ଓନ୍ ସନ୍ ତମେ ଭାବୁଛ କି ମୁଁ ମୋ ନିଜ ପୁଅକୁ ଡରିବି Mr. White goes slowly upstairs, followed by his wife. He takes the paw and stares at it. Then here what is mentioned? That Mr. White goes upstairs, ऊपर को गले ऊपर महला को गले एवं monkeys paw को धरिकी आसिले at the same time he takes the paw and stares at it एवं कौन कले से monkeys paw को आनिले आनिकी monkeys paw I had told you how to wish that one so whenever they have to wish they have to hold like this straight okay straight एमती धरले धरिकी wish करिवा आरंभ कले then Mrs. White is speaking wish चलो wish करो Mr. White is speaking it's foolish and wicked Mrs. White wish Mr. White holding up the paw I wish my son alive again so here what is the wish of Mr. White Mr. White for the second time is speaking that by holding the monkey's paw like this I wish my son to be alive ମୁଁ ଚାହୁଁଛି ଯେ ମୋ ପୁଅ ପୁଣି ଥରେ ବଞ୍ଚି ଯାଉ he drops the paw and sinks trembling into the chair and he drops the paw ସେ ପଟିକୁ ପକେଇ ଦେଲେ ଚେୟାର ଉପରେ ବସି ପଡ଼ିଲେ Mrs. White turns to the window and stands looking out the clock ticks a stair cracks Mrs. White comes and sits by her husband finally a quiet knock is heard Mrs. White jumps up so in the meantime घंटार टिक टिक शब्द सुबिला पाहाचरे किए आशीर्वाद शब्द सुबिला गोटे छोट नॉक सुबिला Mrs. White was very happy because she was sure that her son came Mrs. White से पूरा जंप मार देले Mrs. White what is that Mr. White shakily means like little bit trembling manner it's just a mouse in the world another knock louder this time then Mrs. White is speaking जेतले साउंड किछि सुबिला नॉर्मल जोड़े छोट नॉक सुबिला Mrs. White पचारे की शब्द Mr. White कहछन नाइ नाइ कांथरे कबाटरे बोधे मुसा चलुथिला okay then another knock and after that once more another knock is also there knock 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 tuck 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 sound was audible and Mr. White Mrs. White it's Herbert our son he starts towards the stairs but Mr. White grabs her by the arm then Mrs. White spoke our son came Herbert came then she started going to the downstairs but Mr. White hold her in the arm Mr. White what are you going to do Mrs. White it's Herbert what are you holding me for let go so I can open the door Mr. White hoarsely don't let it in so here look Mr. White has spoken don't let it in he is not speaking don't let him in okay because he has seen the dead body of Herbert now he also can realize that it was looking at that time too horrible that his wife can't bear it okay so then Mrs. White पूरा एमती संघर्ष करछन जे केमती भी से खसी पळेबे से कहछन छाड़ छाड़ मते छाड़ आम पु आछि मु कबाट खोलिबी how can you Mrs. White how can you be afraid of your own son let me go जे तुम तुम निज पु को केमती डरिबो मते छाड़ मु जीबी Mrs. White the knocking is louder and louder she breaks free and runs down to the door Mrs. White I am here Herbert I am right here then she पूरा struggling करथिला ना Mr. White was holding her and she was struggling in the meantime she was free and she started running to the downstairs and Mr. White was there and she was speaking Herbert just wait I'm coming with this it is over but still a scene is being mentioned and what is that as they struggles with the lock Mr. White falls into his knees जिते बेले लॉक माने कोन एमती भिड़िकी धरिबाटा ओके लॉक ऑफ आर्म मीन्स बाहुरे एमती भिड़िकी धरिबा को लॉक ऑफ आर्म कह जाय सो व्हेन मिसेस व्हाइट वाज स्ट्रगलिंग मिस्टर व्हाइट कोन गले आंठे की तळे पड़ी गले he picks up द monkey's paw ऐसे सेकेंड विश द monkey's paw टी तले पके देथिले सेतेले पुणी थे आंठी पड़ी गले से monkey's paw टी टेकिले from the floor and holds it upright in his hand, and once again he started holding the monkey's paw like this. His lips move, but we can't hear him over the thunderous knocking, and Mr. White started speaking something. तांकर lips movement हैला, but एत्ते जरे कबाटर ठक ठक शब्द सुबुथुला जे it was not audible. What was the wish of Mr. White? He drops the paw. तापरे wish कला परे से paw टी monkey's paw पड़ी गला. At once the knocking stops. The knocking suddenly stopped, and the door springs open, and the door was wide open. कबाटटी completely खुला है गला. There is a pause, and then a long loud wail from Mrs. White. Then जेहेतु केही भी नथिले, Mrs. White gave a loud wail. गोटे गभीर चित्कार गोटे से कले. Beyond her the road is empty. और तांको परे परे रास्ताटी पूरा खाली थिला. So remember one thing. Here, nowhere in this chapter it is written that Mrs. White was able to see her son. It might be possible that Herbert was going back, okay, because it was the definitely Mr. White did wish in the third wish that Herbert should go back to its grave, okay. So Herbert might be going back, and when Mrs. White did saw the decomposed body of her son, she might have given a loud scream, but it is nowhere written in the book. Understood it? Listen, as I have told you in the very beginning of the class, there is a movie on this, The Monkey's Paw, a 29 minutes some second movie. You can watch that one. You can complete dialogues are not mentioned, but still for the purpose of entertainment you also can watch that one, and you will learn little bit things, means you can have a clear cut idea on the story, okay. So till that time, in the next class we are going to read another chapter, either it might be from general English or might be from alternate English. So if you have any doubt, you can put me the question. You can join my Telegram group also, English classes name. So all of you have a nice time.